The Why of the War. Sigmund Freud. The Why of the War. Vienna, September 1932. Dear Mr. Einstein. When I found out that you proposed to invite me to exchange ideas on a subject that occupied your interest and that also seemed to be worthy of the interest of others, I was pleased to express my approval. However, I hoped that you would choose a problem close to the limits of our present knowledge, a problem to which each of us, the physicist and the psychologist, could carve out a special access, so that, coming from different sources, we're on the same ground. In such expectation, I was surprised by his question, what could be done to avoid the fate of war? At first I was frightened under the impression of my, I would almost have said, our, incompetence, since that seemed to me a stubborn practice that corresponds to statesmen. But then I realized that you were not asking the question as a researcher of nature and a physicist, but as a friend of humanity, responding to the invitation of the League of Nations, in the manner of Fridtjof Nansen, the Arctic explorer who took in charge of assisting the starving masses and the refugee victims of the World War. Furthermore, I reflected that I was not asked to formulate practical proposals, but only to outline how the problem of preventing wars is presented to psychological consideration. But in your letter you have already expressed almost everything you could say about it. In a certain way, you have taken the wind out of my sails, but I will gladly sail in your wake and I will limit myself to confirming what you state, trying to explain it according to my best science or presumption. You begin with the relationship between law and power. This is, by the way, the most suitable starting point for our investigation. Can I substitute the word power by the term, more resounding and harsher, force? Law and force are today, for us, antagonistic, but it is not difficult to demonstrate that the first arose from the second, and going back to the archaic origins of humanity to observe how this phenomenon was produced, the solution to the enigma is effortlessly presented to us. However, forgive me if in what follows I review, as if they were news, things known and accepted by everyone. The thread of my exposition obliges me to do so. So, in principle, conflicts of interest between men are resolved through the use of force. This is the case throughout the animal kingdom, from which man should not be excluded, but in his case there are also conflicts of opinions that reach the highest heights of abstraction and that would seem to require other resources for their solution. In any case, this is only a relatively recent complication. At the beginning, in the small human horde, the greatest muscular force was the one that decided to whom something should belong or whose will should be carried out. Before long, muscular strength was reinforced and replaced by the use of tools. The one who possessed the best weapons or who knew how to use them with greater skill triumphed. With the adoption of arms, intellectual superiority is already beginning to take the place of brute muscular strength, but the ultimate goal of the fight remains the same, for the damage inflicted on him or for the annihilation of his forces, of the disputing parties must be compelled to abandon their claims or their opposition. This objective is more fully achieved when the enemy's force is definitively eliminated, that is, when he is killed. Such a result offers the double advantage that the enemy cannot start his opposition again and that the fate suffered serves as a lesson, discouraging others who intend to follow his example. Finally, the death of the enemy satisfies an instinctive tendency that I will mention later. At a given moment, the homicidal purpose is opposed by the consideration that by respecting the life of the enemy, but keeping him in fear, he could be used to perform useful services. Thus, the force, instead of killing him, is limited to subjugating him. This is the origin of the respect for the life of the enemy, but from that moment the victor had to reckon with the latent desires for revenge that the defeated harbored, so that he lost a part of his own security. Therefore, this is the original situation: the greatest power, brute or intellectually based force, dominates. We know that this regime was gradually modified in the course of evolution, that some path led from force to right, but what was this path? I believe that it could only be one, the one that goes through the recognition that the greater strength of an individual can be compensated by the association of several weaker ones. L'union fait la force. Violence is defeated by union. The power of the united now represents the right, in opposition to the strength of the isolated individual. We see, then, that the law is nothing but the power of a community. It remains a force ready to turn against any individual who opposes it. He resorts to the same means, pursues the same ends. Ultimately, the difference only resides in the fact that it is no longer the power of the individual that prevails, but that of a group of individuals. But a psychological condition must be fulfilled for this transition from violence to the new right to take place. The unity of the group must be permanent, lasting. Nothing would have been achieved if the association was only formed to fight against an individual who was too powerful, dismembering once he was defeated. The first to feel stronger would again try to dominate through their strength, and the game would be repeated endlessly. The community must be permanently preserved. It must be organized, create precepts that prevent the feared insubordination. It must designate organizations that monitor compliance with the precepts, laws, and must take charge of the execution of legal acts of force. When the members of a human group recognize this community of interests appear between them affective bonds, gregarious feelings that constitute the true foundation of their power. With this, I believe, the essentials have already been given: the overcoming of violence by ceding power to a broader unit, maintained by the effective ties between its members. What happens afterwards are nothing more than applications and repetitions of this formula. The state of affairs is not complicated as long as the community only consists of a certain number of equally strong individuals. The laws of this association then determine to what extent each of its members has to renounce personal freedom to violently exert their force so that a safe life in common is possible. But this peaceful situation is only conceivable theoretically, since in reality it is complicated by the fact that from the beginning the community is formed by elements of disparate power, by men and women, children and parents, and soon after, because of wars and conquests, also by winners and losers who become masters and slaves. The right of the community then becomes an expression of the unequal distribution of power among its members. The laws will be made by and for the dominant and will grant few rights to the subjugated. Since then, there have been two sources of shock to the law in the community, but at the same time they are also shocks to new legislation. On the one hand, some of the masters will try to evade the restrictions of general validity, that is, they will abandon the domain of law to return to the domain of violence. On the other, the oppressed will constantly tend to seek greater power and will want this strengthening to find an echo in the law, that is, to progress from unequal rights to equal rights for all. This last tendency will be all the more powerful if displacements of power relations actually take place in the collective entity, as they do due to multiple historical factors. In such a case, the law can gradually adapt to the new distribution of power, or, what is more frequent, the ruling class will refuse to recognize this transformation and it will lead to rebellion, to civil war, that is, to the temporary suppression of law and renewed violent attempts that, once elapsed, can give way to a new legal order. There is still another source of legal evolution that only manifests itself peacefully. It is the cultural development of the members of the community, but this belongs to a connection that we will not have to consider until later. We see, therefore, that even within the same community, the violent solution of conflicts of interest cannot be avoided. However, the common needs and goals that result from coexistence on the same ground favor the rapid termination of these struggles, so that in these conditions the probability of resorting to peaceful means to resolve conflicts increases incessantly. But a glance at the history of humanity shows us an uninterrupted series of conflicts between one community and another or others, between larger or smaller conglomerates, between cities, regions, tribes, towns, states, conflicts that almost invariably were decided by the warlike comparison of the respective forces. Such wars end either in looting or in the complete subjugation and conquest of one of the contending parties. It is not lawful to judge all wars of conquest with the same criteria. Some, like those of the Mughals and the Turks, only led to calamities; others, on the other hand, to the conversion of violence into law, to the establishment of larger entities, within which the possibility of the deployment of forces was eliminated, solving the problems. Conflicts through a new legal order. Thus, the conquests of the Romans bequeathed the precious Pax Romana to the Mediterranean peoples. The expansive tendencies of the French kings created a peacefully united and prosperous France. Although it may seem paradoxical, it must be recognized that war could well be an appropriate resource to establish the longed-for eternal peace, since it is capable of creating units so large that a strong power lodged within it would make new wars impossible. But in reality the war does not serve this purpose, since the successes of the conquest are not usually lasting. New units generally fall apart again because of poor coherence between the forcibly united parts. In addition, until now the conquest could only create incomplete unions, although extensive, whose internal conflicts further favored violent decisions. Thus, all the war efforts only led humanity to exchange numerous and even continuous small wars for less frequent conflagrations, but all the more devastating. Applying my reflections to current circumstances, I arrive at the same result that you reached by a shorter path. It is only possible to safely prevent wars if men agree to establish a central power, which would be vested with the solution of all conflicts of interest. This formulation undoubtedly involves two conditions: that such a superior instance be created, and that sufficient power be conferred on it. Either one, by itself, would not suffice. Now then, the League of Nations was projected as an instance of this kind, but the second condition was not met. It does not possess autonomous power, and it would only obtain it if the members of the new unit, the different states, conferred it on it. There is no doubt that currently the chances of such a thing happening are very slim. All in all, the institution of the League of Nations would be misjudged if it were not recognized that we are dealing with an attempt rarely undertaken in the history of humanity and perhaps never attempted on such a scale. It is an attempt to gain, through the invocation of certain ideal positions, the authority that is, the power to influence peremptorily that in general derives from power. We have seen that a human community is held together by two factors, the rule of violence and the effective ties. Technically we call them identifications that bind its members. With one of them disappearing, the other may possibly keep the community together. Of course, the aforementioned ideas only have significance if they express important interests common to all individuals. One wonders then what its strength will be. History teaches us that they could indeed exert considerable influence. Thus, for example, the pan-Hellenic idea, the consciousness of being superior to the neighboring barbarians, an idea so powerfully expressed in the Amphictyones, in the oracles and in the festive games, was strong enough to soften the warrior customs of the Greeks, but it was not able to prevent warlike conflicts between the units of the Hellenic people and, what is more, it could not prevent a city or confederation of cities from allying itself with the powerful Persian enemy to the detriment of a rival. Similarly, the feeling of the Christian community, undoubtedly powerful, was not strong enough to prevent during the Renaissance small and large Christian states from requesting the help of the Sultan in their mutual wars. In our time, too, there is no idea to which such unifying authority could be attributed. The fact that currently the national ideals that dominate the people lead to the opposite effect is all too obvious. Some people predict that only the general application of the ideology Bolshevik might put an end to the war, but surely we are still a long way from this goal today, and perhaps we could only achieve it through a terrible civil war. Therefore, it seems that the attempt to substitute the real power for the power of ideas is doomed for the moment to fail. It is a miscalculation if it is not taken into account that the right was originally brute force and that it cannot yet relinquish the support of force. I can now go on to gloss another of your propositions. You express your astonishment at the fact that it is so easy to enthuse men for war, and you suspect that something, an instinct for hatred and destruction, is at work in them to facilitate this ardor. Once again, I can't help but share your opinion freely. We believe in the existence of such an instinct, and precisely in recent years we have tried to study its manifestations. Allow me therefore to explain a part of the theory of instincts that we have arrived at in psychoanalysis after much trial and error. We accept that the instincts of men belong to only two categories: either they are those that tend to preserve and unite, we call them erotic, completely in the sense of the eros of the Platonic Symposium, or sexual, deliberately expanding the popular concept of sexuality, or they are the instincts that tend to destroy and kill, we understand them in the terms aggressive instincts, or destruction. As you note, it is nothing more than a theoretical transfiguration of the antithesis between love and hate, universally known and perhaps primarily related to that other, between attraction and repulsion, which plays such an important role in the field of your science. At this point, let us not rush to introduce the estimative concepts of good and bad. Any one of these instincts is as essential as the other, and from their joint and antagonistic action the manifestations of life arise. Now then, it seems that almost never an instinct belonging to one of these species can act in isolation, since it always appears linked, as we say fused, with a certain original component of the other that modifies its end and that in certain circumstances is the unavoidable requirement, so that this end can be achieved. Thus, the self-preservation instinct, for example, is undoubtedly of an erotic nature, but it is precisely this instinct that needs aggression to carry out its purpose. Similarly, the instinct of object love needs a complement to the instinct of possession in order to seize its object. The difficulty in isolating the two kinds of instincts in their manifestations is what prevented us for so long from recognizing their existence. If you are willing to accompany me another part of my way, you will learn that human acts present yet another complication of a different nature than the previous one. It is extremely rare for an act to be the work of a single instinctive tendency, which, moreover, must already be constituted in itself by eros and destruction. On the contrary, it is generally necessary that several reasons of similar structure coincide for the action to be possible. One of your colleagues, a certain Professor G.C.H. Lichtenberg, who in the days of our classics taught physics in Göttingen, already knew this, perhaps because he was an even more distinguished psychologist than a physicist. He invented the rows of motives, writing, "The motives of human acts can be arranged like the 32 directions of the nautical rows, and their names are formed in a similar way, for example, bread bread glory, or glory glory bread. Consequently, when men are incited to war, there will be in them a great number of motives, noble or base, those that are usually hidden and those that are not. There is reluctance to express that they will answer in the affirmative, but we do not propose to reveal them all here. Surely among them is the pleasure of aggression and destruction. Innumerable cruelties of history and of daily life highlight their existence and their power. The fusion of these destructive tendencies with other erotic and ideal ones naturally facilitates their satisfaction. Sometimes, when we hear about the horrors of history, it seems to us that the ideal motivations only served as a pretext for destructive desires. On other occasions, for example in the face of the cruelties of the Holy Inquisition, we believe that the ideal motives have predominated in consciousness, the destructive ones providing unconscious reinforcement. Both mechanisms are possible. I am afraid of abusing your interest, seized by the prevention of war and not by our theories. Still, I would like to dwell a moment longer on our destructive drive, whose popularity is by no means matched by its importance. It happens that through a certain display of speculation we have come to conceive that this instinct works in every living being, causing the tendency to lead it to its disintegration, to reduce life to the state of inanimate matter. It deserves, therefore, in every sense the designation of death instinct, while the erotic instincts represent the tendencies towards life. The death instinct becomes the destruction instinct when, with the help of special organs, it is directed outwards, towards objects. The living being somehow protects his own life by destroying the life of others. But a part of the death instinct remains active inside the being. We have tried to explain a large number of normal and pathological phenomena by means of this internalization of the destructive instinct. We have even committed the heresy of attributing the origin of our moral conscience to such an interior orientation of aggression. As you warn, the fact that this process is acquiring excessive magnitude is cause for concern, it would be directly harmful to health, while the orientation of said instinctive energies towards destruction in the external world relieves the living being, it must produce a benefit. Let this serve as a biological excuse for all the evil and dangerous tendencies against which we fight. Let us not fail to recognize that they are more akin to nature than our resistance against them, which on the other hand also needs to be explained. Perhaps you have acquired the impression that our theories form a kind of mythology, and if they did, it would not even be a pleasant mythology. But are not all the sciences of nature oriented towards a mythology of this kind? Are you in a different situation today in physics? From what precedes we derive for our immediate purposes the conclusion that the purposes to eliminate the aggressive tendencies of man will be useless. They say that in very happy regions of the earth, where nature offers lavishly what man needs for his subsistence, there are peoples whose life passes peacefully, among whom force and aggression are unknown. I can hardly believe it, and I would like to find out more about these happy beings. The Bolsheviks also hope that they will be able to eliminate human aggression by ensuring the satisfaction of material needs and establishing equality among the members of the community. I think that is an illusion. For now they are heavily armed and hold their supporters together, in no small measure, by hatred of all outsiders. On the other hand, as you yourself warn, it is not a question of completely eliminating human aggressive tendencies. One can try to divert them, to the point that they do not need to seek their expression in war. Starting from our mythological theory of instincts, we easily find a formula containing the indirect means of fighting war. If the willingness to war is a product of the destructive instinct, the easiest thing to do will be to appeal to the antagonist of that instinct, Eros. Everything that establishes effective bonds between men must act against war. These links can be of two kinds. First, the ties analogous to those that bind us to the objects of love, although devoid of sexual ends. Psychoanalysis need not be ashamed to speak here of love, since religion also says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." This is easy to demand, but difficult to comply with. The other form of effective bonding is that which is carried out by identification. When you establish important common elements between men, you awaken such feelings of community, identifications. The structure of human society is largely based on them. You complain about the abuses of authority, and that gives me a second indication for the indirect fight against the tendency to war. The fact that men are divided into leaders and led is an expression of their innate and irremediable inequality. Subordinates form the vast majority. They need an authority that makes decisions for them, to which they generally submit unconditionally. It should be added here that more effort needs to be made to educate a top layer of men endowed with independent thinking, inaccessible to intimidation, who fight for the truth and to whom the leadership of the dependent masses corresponds. It is not necessary to demonstrate that the abuses of the powers of the state and the censorship of thought by the Church can in no way favor this education. The ideal situation would naturally be that of a community of men who had submitted their instinctive life to the dictatorship of reason. Nothing else could lead to such a complete and resistant unity of men, even if the effective ties between them were renounced. But in all probability this is a utopian hope. The other ways to indirectly avoid war are certainly more accessible, but on the other hand they do not promise an immediate result. It is hard to think of mills that grind so slowly that you would starve before you had flour. As you can see, not much is achieved when, in the case of an urgent and practical task, one turns to the theoretician far from the world. It will be better in each particular case to try to face the danger with the resources available at the time, but I would still like to refer to a question that you do not raise in your letter and that interests me particularly. Why are you and I and so many others so indignant against the war? Why don't we accept it as one more among the many painful miseries of life? It seems natural, biologically well-founded, practically almost unavoidable. Don't be outraged by my question, because in the case of an investigation you can surely adopt the mask of a superiority that you don't really have. The answer will be that every man has a right to his own life, that war destroys human lives full of hope, places the individual in demeaning situations, forces him to kill others, which he doesn't want to do. It destroys expensive material assets, products of human labor, and much more. Furthermore, war in its current form is no longer. It offers opportunity to fulfill the old heroic ideal, and a future war would involve the elimination of one or perhaps both enemies due to the improvement of the means of destruction. All this is true, and it seems so undeniable that one is astonished to observe that wars have not yet been condemned by the General Council of all men. However, it is possible to discuss some of these points. One might ask if the community does not also have a right to the life of the individual. Furthermore, all kinds of wars cannot be condemned in the same measure. Finally, as long as there are states and nations that are willing to unscrupulously destroy others, these others must be prepared for war. But I will quickly leave these topics, since this is not the discussion to which you have invited me. I want to address another goal. I believe that the main reason why we rise up against the war is that we cannot do otherwise. We are pacifists because for organic reasons we must be. Then it is easy for us to base our position on intellectual arguments. This is surely not understandable without an explanation. I believe the following: since time immemorial, the process of cultural evolution has been taking place in humanity. I know that others prefer to call it civilization. To this process we owe the best that we have achieved, and also a good part of what causes our suffering. Its causes and its origins are uncertain, its solution, doubtful, some of its features, easily appreciable. Perhaps it will lead to the disappearance of the human species, since it inhibits the sexual function in more than one sense, and already today the uneducated races and the backward layers of the population reproduce more quickly than those of high culture. Perhaps this process is comparable to the domestication of certain animal species. It certainly brings with it organic modifications, but we cannot yet get used to the idea that this cultural evolution is an organic process. The psychic modifications that accompany cultural evolution are remarkable and unmistakable. They consist in a progressive displacement of instinctive goals and in a growing limitation of instinctive tendencies. Sensations that were pleasant to our ancestors are indifferent or even unpleasant to us. The fact that our ideal ethical and aesthetic requirements have changed has an organic foundation. Among the psychological characteristics of culture, two seem to be the most important: the strengthening of the intellect, which begins to dominate the instinctive life, and the internalization of aggressive tendencies, with all its beneficial and dangerous consequences. Now then, the psychic attitudes that have been imposed on us by the process of culture are negated by war in the most violent way, and that is why we rise up against war. We simply can't stand it anymore, and it is not a question here of an intellectual and effective aversion, but in us, the pacifists, a constitutional intolerance is agitated, so to speak, an idiosyncrasy magnified to the maximum. And it would seem that the aesthetic debasement implicit in the war contributes to our rebellion no less than its cruelties. How long will we have to wait until the others also become pacifists? It is difficult to say, but perhaps it is not a utopian hope that the influence of these two factors, the cultural attitude and the well-founded fear of the consequences of future war, will put an end to war conflicts in the course of a limited period of time. It is impossible for us to guess by what paths or detours this end will be achieved. For now we can only say to ourselves, everything that promotes cultural evolution works against war. I cordially greet you and beg your pardon if my exposition has disappointed you. Yours, Sigmund Freud. End. The Why of the War. Sigmund Freud.